Welcome to the home for Bible geeks everywhere. This is the Edge Podcast with Scott Logan.
What's up, Bible geeks, and welcome to the Edge Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Logan, hoping that you guys in the U.S. had an awesome Thanksgiving last week. We didn't have a show last week because, well, I wanted to take the week off with my family. But now the Christmas season is officially here, and this is where I'm actually okay with it. Call me old-fashioned, but I'm not a fan of celebrating Christmas before Thanksgiving. I'm the type that wants to focus on one holiday at a time as they come up in my queue of holidays. So now that Thanksgiving is over, I am totally fine celebrating Christmas. As a matter of fact, over this past weekend, my family put up the Christmas tree. We filmed it and put it up on our YouTube channel, which you can get to by going to loganfamilyvideos.com. That's actually the URL to get to the channel directly. So go check it out. It's a lot of fun. It's a great video. But Christmas has kind of taken over in my household, and I've decided to go along with it. So everything in my life over the last few days has been Christmas music and Christmas movies and eggnog. Actually, a lot of eggnog, and also dessert. Now, on Thanksgiving, I decided to end a 20-week-long fast from sweets that I've been on, and my problem is that I'm already moving towards the slippery slope of allowing too much back in my life already. And I fear this going into Thanksgiving because if I have an addiction, it's food. And I've managed to control myself and purge myself of sweets for 20 weeks. That's a huge victory for a guy like me, and that's been a great feeling. But I was afraid that if I tasted sweets again, I would turn into the shark on Finding Nemo, who once he smelled blood again, his eyes turned black and he had no self-control, and then he started chasing the other fish trying to eat them. I'll admit it, my eyes got black with the taste of dessert, and I've gone overboard a little. So I've learned something about myself. For me to be successful in losing weight and beating my body into submission when it comes to getting healthy, I need to be really careful this holiday season and beyond. So, no more cookies, no more cakes, just healthy foods, a lot of exercise, and good decisions. Now, one holiday tradition I've had since being a kid is watching every version of the Christmas Carol that I can. That's my favorite Christmas story, outside of the birth of Christ and the Christmas Story.
No, I want an officer right out of carbonization 200 Germany battle rifle.
You'll shoot your eye out, kid. Merry Christmas. Ho, ho, ho.
But I love the Charles Dickens classic, The Christmas Carol. I've actually never read the book, but I'm pretty sure that I've seen every movie of the story there is. Over this past weekend, we watched my favorite version of it, which is The Muppet Christmas Carol. It's a beautiful story of redemption, the story of Scrooge. Scrooge is this incredibly rich guy who possesses far more than he needs, but he also has zero compassion for those in need.
There goes Mr. Humbug, there goes Mr. Grimm. If they gave a prize for being mean, the winner would be him.
He spent his whole life accumulating wealth, a lot of money, fancy clothes, etc., and he has accumulated it on the backs of the poor. He admittedly paid Bob Cratchit far less than what Cratchit was worth, even to the point of being stingy with the coal that heated their place of business. Poor Bob had to work in cold conditions. When it came to charity, we all know those infamous words that Scrooge said that eventually would come back to haunt him.
If they'd rather die, then they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
It kind of makes me wonder if Charles Dickens read James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, which is where we are at today. In some aspects, it's also like the ghost of Jacob Marley was using James's words to warn Ebenezer. Let's go ahead and start our study. So we're starting the final chapter of the book of James, and we're also starting to see the end of James in sight. But today we're focusing just on James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, which say this: "Come now, you rich people, Weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you. Your wealth is ruined, and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your silver and gold are corroded, and their corrosion will be the witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You stored up treasure in the last days. Look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who reaped your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived luxuriously on the land and have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered. The righteous man, he does not resist you. Now, while chapter 5 is just the next phase of the same conversation that we've been having for the last several months, it does have some self-contained thoughts that I don't want to jumble together. So for the sake of time on this podcast, especially during the busy holiday season, we're going to break these thoughts down and these chapters up into different episodes that will be shorter in length. So I don't really expect the remainder of season 2 to have long episodes, but who knows? I could always be wrong. We say this every week on the show to the point of it sounding very repetitive. But James, throughout this epistle, keeps adding to a series of tests to judge the validity of your faith. All the way through this epistle, as he writes to a group of Jewish Christians in a local assembly, he challenges them to evaluate the authenticity of their faith, knowing that always where there is the true, there will also be the false. James wants to be sure that no one is under any illusion about being a Christian when in fact they're not. And so all the way through the epistle, you have one test after another. And this is no different. This is the next thought-provoking test that he gives us. And that is that how a person feels about and handles wealth is a test. How you prioritize money and possessions and material things is a test which reveals the spiritual state of your heart. And James here is speaking to people who, though on the outside may affirm faith in Christ and a love for God, obviously they love their money. And their life is totally controlled and governed by that love of money. And so their spiritual state is revealed in the matter of their relationship to their riches. Guys, it's all around us today. I grew up with it all around me. Not in my own family. I mean, we had weeks when I was a kid where we were pretty poor, and that day before payday was always identified by a 10-cent package of Kool-Aid and a 15-cent package of ramen. But I know families who were wrapped up in this, and I know families today that are still are. I had friends who were from families who just chased wealth and viewed the status of your bank account as synonymous with the amount of love that God has for you. The bigger the dollar sign and the nicer the house, the more right standing with God you must have. If you're poor, you must be doing something wrong and you haven't grasped the blessing that God has for you. And if you're financially well off, then man, God must be working in your life. It's maddening and it's shameful and it's all around us, especially here in the West. If you want to tell me where your heart is, show me where your treasure is. Where are you stockpiling your treasure? Where are you placing your wealth? That's the test that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 21, where he said, "Don't collect for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but collect for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." There's a Christian children's music group that my daughter loves called Slugs and Bugs that sing a song about that. And I can almost guarantee that when she hears this podcast, my wife has probably already started breaking out into that song as she's listening to this. Anyway, so Jesus said it first. James isn't coming up with a new concept in chapter 5. James is merely echoing the test that Jesus originated. Jesus also said in Luke 16, verse 13, "No household slave can be the slave of two masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't be slaves to both God and money." So James is really just reiterating a test given by Jesus. It's a passage of damning judgment against the wealthy, wicked who profess Christian faith and profess Christian life, but whose real God is money. James is building on the teaching of Jesus, as he often does. In fact, there are really many parallels in the Epistle of James to the Sermon on the Mount, which we've discussed that fact before. But let me say this. Wealth in and of itself isn't sinful. It's not sinful to possess money. It's not sinful to possess the blessings that God would grant if God has chosen to grant you stewardship over that kind of thing. Money isn't for everyone, though. God knows our hearts and our future in a way that we never will, and so he chooses some with the responsibility of a lot of money, and quite frankly, some for Kool-Aid and ramen. There are some people who can't handle money. That's probably why I don't have any, because God knows that if I had a lot of money, I'd want to spend it all on Chinese food delivery and Xbox. But all of us do have some wealth to manage, whether little or a lot, and it varies from person to person by God's design. And God can bless us in different ways, giving some of us more and some less than others. It's not wrong to possess it, but it's obviously wrong to misuse it. And really, the more you have, the greater the potential for corrupting its proper use. When your heart is perverted and the love of money controls you, then it leads, according to 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, to all kinds of evil. So James is speaking against the love of money that causes people to take what's a blessing from God and pervert it for their own selfish ambition. They may say they're Christians. They may belong to the church. They may go to a church. But James is saying you better take a look at what they do with their money because, as Jesus taught, it will reveal the state of their heart. If you serve money, you don't serve God. If they're laying up all their treasure in heaven, that's where their heart is, simply put. So back in verse 1, James says, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail over the miseries that are coming on you." This is a strong statement of judgment. James is saying inescapable doom is coming, and you ought to have the reaction of weeping and wailing. We talked about the term "come now" on the previous show back in chapter 4. It's really kind of a snappy call to action. Hey, listen up. That's basically what it is. It could be translated "now listen," or "get this," or "see here." It's calling their attention. It's an attack in an Old Testament prophetic style. He calls them to perk up their ears and listen. And so he says, "Come now, you rich people." And that right there is who this is directed to. That's the group here that this concerns. So who exactly are these people anyway? Well, the Bible tells us that the rich are people who have more than they need. That's really the definition of being rich. Some people might be familiar with the term discretionary money. Basically, it's money that doesn't have to be accounted for something. It's the extra money after you've provided for the basic essentials. If all you have is just enough to buy what you need to survive, then you wouldn't really fall into the rich category. But if you have any money or resources after your needs are provided, the Bible calls you rich. Probably a very different standard than how most of us view being poor or rich these days. So the wealthy are those who still have money once their needs are met. And the wicked are the ones who misuse and abuse the stewardship of that discretionary money. And so he's directing his attention to those whose lives are a continual abuse of their resources. And James tells them to weep and wail. The word for weep is, here we go again, kleosite. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? And it means to sob loudly. This word is used often as describing the loud kind of sobbing that you might see or hear at a funeral. It usually refers to death. It's also used for the weeping and the wailing out loud that comes as a result of shame and regret. So this is speaking of a verbal, vocal, loud, lamenting, wailing kind of sorrow. Strong emotional outburst as people see the inescapable, damning judgment of hell facing them. Now that word, miseries, has to do with wretchedness. It has to do with overwhelming trouble and overwhelming suffering and distress. And it's your miseries. He's personalizing it. So these are the miseries that are coming specifically on you. It's not generic. He's not saying collectively all of you should sob because collectively you're all going to suffer. He's saying you individually ought to wail because you're individually going to suffer misery. He doesn't tell us when it's coming because nobody knows when, but he's speaking of the coming of Christ. It's coming when they meet God. Judgment is inevitable. That's the cry here. Judgment on the wealthy wicked. And he brings out some characteristics of these people with how they are misusing the resources that they have in verses 2 and 3. And simply put, what James is talking about is hoarding. And he says this: your wealth is ruined, and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your silver and gold are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You stored up treasure in the last days. He's saying you have stockpiled your wealth to the point where it's become wasted. Someone might ask, well, is that really wrong? The answer is yes, because your wealth has been excluded from its proper use and purpose. It's uselessly piled up. So breaking that statement down, when James says your wealth is ruined, that part of the statement isn't actually referring to money. The word wealth is the word plautos, and the word comes from the name of one of the ancient Greek gods of mythology. His name, Plautos, means the abundant yielding of the earth. He was said in Greek mythology to be the son of Demetra, the goddess of the earth. So the word Plautos has a connection through Greek mythology with what the earth produces. So that's really what this word means. Simply put, it's talking about food. It refers to the food, vegetables, grains, and perhaps even meat that are stored up as a result of the products of the earth. And bear in mind that these were not cans of food or Twinkies that will, survive a nuclear holocaust. This was real food that would be stored for so long that no one gets to eat it because it goes bad. So he says all your hoarded food is rotted. And the picture here is not of a judgment, but a reality. You can't keep it because it's going to rot. You can't stockpile it because it will decay. Hoarding it is useless because in the end, it's going to be no good to anybody. And he also mentions the word clothes, which is the word hematia, which speaks of the loose, long outer robe that they would put rich embroidery and jewelry on. These robes were passed on as heirlooms, and you could literally have a fortune wrapped up in these garments. But when those garments were folded and stacked somewhere and just left there, moths could come in and destroy them. Guess they didn't use Granny's mothballs. Then he mentions silver and gold being corroded, and many might think that's weird because the coins that we know today wouldn't necessarily rust. But there is some substantial evidence that coins in those days were not pure silver or pure gold, but mixed with an alloy that, given the right circumstances, could still rust. And James says money stashed somewhere over a long period of time, buried in the ground, may itself rust. And then what do you have? You have nothing. James's point is basic here. It's sinful, foolish, and stupid to hoard money, clothing, and food when it's all going to rot. And even if it remains, you're not going to. And if that's the way you've lived your life, the question is whether you worship God at all. And he says, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. Basically, he's just saying that all this wasted stuff will testify to your hoarding. It will testify to your useless stockpiling of it. In talking about this subject, John MacArthur has a great quote, and I have to read this to you because it's really well put. MacArthur said, "The ruin of the things the rich hoarded is a graphic picture of their own ruin. Their hoarded, rotted, moth-eaten, rusted riches give loud testimony to the state of their heart. The rotting, corroded riches that are hoarded become the witness at the divine court to bring unarguable evidence for their eternal damnation. Their covetous, selfish, compassionless, earthbound approach to life becomes in itself their condemnation. All that hoarded wealth is witness for the prosecution declaring their guilt and the just God to condemn them to hell. Wow. Then James tags on to verse 3 this line. He says, you stored up treasure in the last days. In Greek, it says, and you've done it in these last days. He's basically saying you did this in the Messianic period with no regard for God's clock, no regard for redemptive history, no regard for eternity, just totally wasting your life and all your resources, amassing wealth in a day when the world is perishing. How dare you? In verse 4, it only gets worse with these people. It says, look, the pay that you withheld from the workers who reaped your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. So not only were these guys hoarding, but they were hoarding what was unjustly robbed in the first place. They exploited the poor. Instead of giving to them, they withheld from them. Instead of giving them the small wage that they had earned, they kept it back. He said, look, with an exclamation point, because it's hard to believe, because it's so contrary to their claim to be Christians. It's shocking behavior for someone who claims Jesus. Now, the word for worker here means day laborer. Many of these guys would hang out in the marketplaces looking for jobs, and so these dishonest rich people would hire them on to do honest work in their fields and then refuse to pay them what they were due. And this wasn't about delayed payments. It wasn't like they were saying, oh, hey, man, can I pay you on Friday? They were flat out refusing to pay these poor workers after they did the job. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't pay them anything. What it means is they didn't pay them what they were due. So the rich then had money hoarded that they unjustly gained. And then in the same way that James said that wasted rotten food and moth-eaten clothes were a testimony to these wicked people, he says the same thing when he says, the pay that you withheld from the workers who reaped your fields cries out, and the outcry of the harvesters has reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. He's personifying these inanimate things to get the point across that it's all evidence against these people. He also calls God the Lord of hosts as an encouragement to those who have been taken advantage of. Basically, he's saying the one who hears you is the Almighty God who commands the armies of heaven and who will call that army into judgment. So, what we've seen is that these wealthy, wicked people have hoarded food, clothes, and money that they've gained unjustly on the backs of the poor people that they've taken advantage of. And now they use their riches in verse 5 to live self-indulgently. It says in verse 5, you have lived luxuriously on the land and have indulged yourselves. You have fattened your hearts for the day of slaughter. The word here for luxury is basically soft living. James is saying you live in a very cushy life. And then the next word in that statement is indulge, which actually in the original text is talking about vices. Indulging in a vice becomes a natural evolution from living a very soft and cushy existence. They lived the soft life of luxury, which led to indulging in vices. You start living the soft life and it takes its toll. And you begin to be consumed with your own pleasure, and your own pleasure takes over, and then you want all the pleasures that you desire, and luxury turns to vice. You see, a life without self-denial is a life that soon runs out of control in every area. People totally concerned and obsessed with luxury and pleasure eventually just can't restrain themselves. I have known people, and I still do, who, without any care in the world, would and will refrain from giving even $1 to someone in need, but will spend thousands of dollars to make their kitchen look prettier. They will close their eyes to the needs of the poor around them, and they will close their eyes to the work of God. And the only thing they will open their eyes for is their own self-gratification. They'll pass the hungry homeless in the street and look down on them as they go into a restaurant and eat an overpriced meal, and then bring their leftovers home and then eventually throw them out because they went bad. This exists everywhere, and not just in the carnal world, but also in those who claim the mercy of Christ. Then James says, you have fattened your hearts. The Greek word is trepho, and it means to feed, nourish, or fatten. It's used of an animal. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint, that word is used in Jeremiah 46:21, talking about fattening up calves. The idea is, if you've ever raised cattle or any kind of animal like that, you fatten them up for slaughter. That's the whole point. You fatten them up because the fatter they are, the more they're going to bring you when you weigh them, and that's why you fatten them. And he says you fatten your hearts, meaning you've satiated yourself. You've indulged yourself to the limit. If you wanted to buy it, you bought it. If you wanted to do it, you did it. And you drank the cup dry. You started with soft luxury, and then you led yourself right into vice, and you have satiated every desire you've got. When it says you fattened your hearts, it means your inner desires. You sought to fill out every single self-indulgence you had. There was nothing left on the table. James uses some pretty vivid and scary lingo when he uses the day of slaughter as a depiction of the day of judgment. The wealthy wicked who have uselessly hoarded the money they unjustly robbed and have self-indulgently spent it are simply fattened calves who are waiting for the judgment of God. But you know what? There's still hope for them through repentance and real faith in Jesus, right? Now, James ends this section with a statement that was really more to do with what was going on in that community. So it's a statement very much geared to that Jewish community. But I think we can still take some application from this for ourselves. He says this in verse 6, "You have condemned, you have murdered. The righteous man, he does not resist you." James is bringing up a specific problem that he briefly brushed past in chapter 2, and that was the situation of a corrupt judicial system. You might remember a while back when we were studying chapter 2 about avoiding favoritism, and we read this in verse 6, "Don't the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts?" And in chapter 5 here, James says, "You have condemned, you have murdered." And he was talking about how the rich were always trying to use the judicial system to affect the poor negatively. He's saying you have sentenced people and effectively you've murdered them with judicial murder. You literally have used the courts to murder them. James is saying you start out amassing. Your amassed fortune, in part, is due to defrauding others. You then begin to spend it on your lusts, which are so consumed that you literally destroy people in the process. You destroy them. Your plan to be wealthy and stay wealthy comes at the cost of everyone else. And then James ends with this, "The righteous man, he does not resist you." To be honest, you can't really be too dogmatic about what he means here. But what I've studied about is that the most widely believed understanding of that is that James is talking about the innocent one who was abused or the innocent one who was destroyed for the sake of fulfilling the lust of the wicked wealthy. And that this person, as a righteous person trying to live out their faith and follow the example of Jesus, doesn't retaliate back. They're following Christ's example that Peter talked about in 1 Peter 2:23 when he was talking about Jesus, and he said, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he was suffering, he did not threaten, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. Now, let me clarify that all this judgment we're talking about isn't for the Christian. James is talking specifically to rich people who claim to be Christians but are not. And we know they're not because the life they live openly doesn't reflect it at all. Why do they say they're Christians? I don't know. Maybe they have an angle.
Well, let me ask you, because one of the potential attack lines has to do with an answer you gave to Frank Luntz months ago when you said that you've never asked God for forgiveness. Do you regret making that remark?
No, I have great relationship with God. I have great relationship with the evangelicals. In fact, nationwide, I'm up by a lot. I'm leading everybody. But I like to be good. I don't like to have to ask for forgiveness, and I am good. I don't do a lot of things that are bad. I try and do nothing that's bad. I live a very different life than probably a lot of people would think. And I have a very
Always, or just
I have
now?
a very great relationship with God, and I have a very great relationship with evangelicals, and I think that's why I'm doing so well with Iowa.
And I asked Jerry and I asked some of the folks, because I hear this is a major theme right here, but 2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17, that's the whole ball game. Where the Spirit of the Lord, right? Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And here there is Liberty College, but Liberty University, but it is so true. You know, when you think, and that's really, is that the one you like? I think that's the one you like, because I loved it. And it's so representative of what's taken place.
I'm going to get in so much trouble with certain people over that. Anyway, this was written to those who claimed to be Christians but were not, as evidenced by their love of money. But at the same time, we as believers can learn from this because we don't want to repeat the sins of the wicked. We desire to live lives that are separated from that. We want to be sure that we use what we have for the advancement of the kingdom, the advancement of the gospel, for the glory of the Lord, and that we don't love the world, and that we're not concerned with being friends of the world, that we don't want to lay up our treasures in this world, that we don't want to be lovers of money. Quite the contrary, we want to use every resource we have for the sake of the glory of Christ. Guys, our Western cultures long for riches, and they idolize the rich. There's no greater evidence of that than some of the celebrity reality TV that absolutely glorifies lavish Hollywood lifestyles. Because we as a culture are obsessed with wealth, I suspect each of us is more sold out to wealth, finances, and possessions than we actually realize. I don't think you have to be a rich Hollywood A-lister to get caught up in material things. Listen to this, or as James would say, come now. These are some eye-opening facts, especially for those of us in the States who easily take for granted what we have. At the rich end of the consumption spectrum, 20% of the world's population uses 76% of the world's goods and services. Did you catch that? 20% of the world's population uses 76% of the world's goods and services. Now, on the bottom end of the world's population, on the poor end, the bottom 20%, they only use 1.5% of the world's goods and services. Just from the fact that you are listening to this podcast means you are probably listening with a smartphone or your computer. Maybe you're watching it on your TV through Roku or Xbox, whatever it may be. That would put you and I as a part of the wealthy 20%. That means, on average, you or I consume 50 times more goods and services than a person in the poorer 20% of this world. In other words, what other people consume over 2 months is used up by you and I in only 1 day. As members of the richest 20%, what power does our prosperity have over us, shaping and controlling our attitudes and behaviors? How does our affluence influence our views and treatment towards others? Let's remember this as we enter into this holiday season. Let's be generous with what we have to support the needs of those around us. Let's be considerate of others. Let's place others' basic needs ahead of our own materialism. Like Ebenezer Scrooge, who would eventually go on to live as the most charitable man in the city, let's take the blessings that we've been given stewardship over and use them to build people up and meet their needs to the glory of the one who gave them to us. We'll be right back after this.
With a grateful prayer and a thankful heart.
Where truth and entertainment are BFFs. The Edge Podcast with Scott Logan.
Hi, I'm Todd Nettleton, and this is the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. The pastor's cell phone vibrated and he stepped outside to take the call. Suddenly, 2 gunshots rang out. Shot through the neck and chest, Pastor Sultan was found lying in a pool of blood in front of his church in Punjab, India. He left behind his loving wife, family, and a congregation needing a new leader. His church had just celebrated its 25th anniversary, rejoicing even as they saw the mounting opposition from Hindu extremists. Pray for Pastor Sultan's church and for all Christians in India that God will raise up new leaders and that their witness will shine all the more brightly in the face of persecution.
I will not let my brothers and sisters suffer in silence, nor will I let them serve alone. To join me in prayer for persecuted Christians, go to vomradio.net.
Join the conversation. Use hashtag BibleGeek and follow us on Twitter at EdgePodcast1. This is The Edge with Scott Logan.
Well, guys, thanks so much for listening to the show this week. Again, I hope that you guys have an amazing Christmas season coming up, filled with love, mercy, and grace that overflows out of your life and into the lives of others. If you want to know more about the Edge Podcast, then please visit the official website by going to www.theedgepodcast.com. All of my social media links are in the top right corner of the page. So when you're there, please check out the Facebook page and give it a like. And also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at EdgePodcast1. Next week, we'll continue on in James chapter 5. But until then, I'm Scott Logan saying, live on the edge.
You've been listening to The Edge Podcast with Scott Logan. Visit the website, www.theedgepodcast.com, for a complete list of episodes, blogs, merchandise, and more. And above all else, live on the edge.